Hi everyone, welcome back to the next of our world history video lectures. Today's topic is the Crusades, and we're going to focus on the causes and effects of religious violence between Christian communities of Europe and Muslim communities of Western Asia and North Africa in the 11th and 12th centuries. The Crusades are often viewed from a simplistic perspective as a clash between East and West, a clash between Christianity and Islam as social and religious systems. But this is to oversimplify a very difficult and complex set of conflicts. The first thing that I want you to get about the causes of the Crusades is their complexity and the importance of internal division within the Christian and European as well as the Muslim West Asian world. We're going to focus on a few causes of the Crusades today. We're going to think about why the First Crusade was successful from the point of view of the Catholic papacy and the French and German knights who took part in it. But we're going to also think about why the Crusades failed as a long-term movement and why, in fact, they contributed to greater problems of Christian-Muslim division in the Middle East and the larger world. So there are three major causes of the First Crusade. And again, they're rooted in division within the Muslim world and the world of Christian Europe. The first of them to think about is the expansion of the Seljuk Turkish Empire, which begins in the middle of the 1000s and helps prompt the appeal from the Byzantine Empire to Western Christians for aid. Seljuk Turks are a nomadic people. They're one of a larger group of Turkish-speaking peoples who populated much of Central Asia between the western parts of China and Persia and parts of what's now Afghanistan. There had been a series of Turkish kingdoms and empires during the early Middle Ages that competed and traded with the Chinese Empire to the east and with the Sasanian Persian Empire and then the forces of the Arab caliphs to the west. In the 1000s, there's a large Turkish kingdom that grows, led by a dynasty from the Seljuk clan. They've converted to the Sunni branch of Islam, and they spread west successfully along the trade routes. They move into parts of what's now Iran and Iraq, and they take advantage of the breakup and decline of the Abbasid Caliphate, which had been based at Baghdad. In 1055, the Turks captured the city of Baghdad. They kept the Arab Caliph there as a sort of religious figurehead, but a Turkish king or sultan now becomes the leader of the Seljuk Empire. And again, it stretches from what's now Afghanistan in the east west to parts of what is now Iraq and Syria. Now, this prompted religious warfare within the Muslim world. The major rival of the Sunni Seljuk Turks was a Shiite state in the Kingdom of Egypt. Egypt in the 900s had come under the leadership of a Shiite family called the Fatimid dynasty. And the Fatimids control not only Egypt itself, but also the Levant, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. That means that Shiite Muslims, since the 900s, had been in control of the holy city of Jerusalem, the holy city that is sacred to Christians, to Jews, and to Muslims within their own religious tradition. Jerusalem had been ruled by one Muslim dynasty and another for 400 years, ever since the success of the Arab conquests in the 630s CE. The Arab rulers of Jerusalem had extended religious tolerance to its population. They did require non-Muslim residents to pay special taxes to practice their own religions, but synagogues and Christian churches are allowed alongside mosques. The holiest space in the city, the former site of the Jewish temple, had been claimed for the city's largest mosque, the Dome of the Rock, which started construction during the 600s. And for 4 centuries, Jews, Christians, and Muslims had lived together under the rule of different Arab states in Jerusalem. So Muslim rule over Christians was nothing new. The situation had long allowed peaceful worship and even pilgrimage to Christian sites by Christians from parts of Europe to the west. These injected money into the local economy. They were welcomed by the local Arab rulers for the most part. However, with the rise of the Seljuk Turks, Jerusalem became the front line in a war zone between Sunni Muslims in the east and Shiite Muslims in the west. The Seljuk Turks expanded. They were trying to drive their empire all the way to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. They fought the Fatimid Egyptians, and in the 1070s, in 1075, the Seljuks managed to defeat the Fatimids, drive them out of Jerusalem, and establish Sunni Muslim instead of Shiite Muslim control of the Holy City. The Fatimid Egyptians retreated into Egypt and bided their time to counterattack and try to retake the Holy City. Now, in the fighting, in the crossfire, Christians and Jews, as well as Muslims, were harmed. And the new Seljuk rulers over Jerusalem appear to have offended the local Christian religious sensibilities. The pilgrimage routes were temporarily shut down, and this sparked panic among other Christians who feared that their access to the holy places would be cut off. So this is one part of the larger struggle that's going to drive Christians to try to fight to take back Jerusalem from Muslim rule after 4 centuries of coexistence there. The second part of the Crusades' origins has to do with the continuing decline of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, again, is closely associated with the Eastern branch of Christianity, the Eastern Orthodox Church. And therefore, it has a special connection to the city of Jerusalem. The Byzantine rulers believe that it's their role to ensure freedom for pilgrims to go to Jerusalem, even though they have not ruled at Jerusalem itself for 4 whole centuries. Now, when the Seljuk Turks expand, they not only attack Shiite Muslims in Jerusalem, but they also attack the Byzantine Empire in Turkey. And they take over the territory that then is known as Turkey, as the land of the Turks, in part because of their conquests. This is another great shrinking of Byzantine territory. The Byzantines are losing their last footholds in the Middle East. They lose a big battle to the Turks at Manzikert in Turkey in 1071. The Byzantine emperor is captured. The Byzantines are losing another portion of the remaining lands in the Middle East. And this sparks a panic over whether their empire will continue to exist at all. Now, under these tense circumstances, a new Byzantine ruler named Alexius I came to power. And in the 1090s, Alexius I, the Byzantine emperor, would make the difficult decision to ask for alliance against the Turks from the Pope in Rome, from the leader of the Western Christian or Roman Catholic Church. This is especially difficult because there's a lot of distrust between the Eastern Greek or Byzantine branch of Christianity and the Western or Roman Catholic branch. In 1054, there had been a permanent schism or split between Eastern and Western Christians. The Eastern and Western churches had excommunicated one another. Their leaders had claimed that the followers of the other half of the Christian church were heretics, were damned if they did not repent and accept true authority. And this is really difficult in political terms for a leader like Alexius to reach out to Western Christians under these circumstances. But Alexius is desperate. Byzantine defenses in the east are crumbling. His army is small. The Turks seem unstoppable. and he's afraid that if they're not pushed back, that they will attack Constantinople itself. As a result, Alexius decides to ask for knights from Western Europe. And he believes that he can do this by appealing to the Catholic Pope based on their common Christianity and suggesting that they should work together to liberate Christian Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Again, this is something of a cynical political play. The Byzantines have not ruled Jerusalem for 400 years and do not really have a strong claim to the city at this point. But Alexius writes to the Pope, who is named Urban II, and he asks Urban II to use his authority over the Catholic Church to recruit mounted knights. The armored horsemen of France and Germany and other parts of Western Europe by this point have a strong military reputation. And the Byzantines believe that if these Western knights come to them as allies, they can work together, they can retake Jerusalem and start rebuilding the Byzantine Empire, and they can check the growth of Turkish Islam. Now this brings us to our third component. We've thought about the Turks, we've thought about the Byzantines, but now we need to consider Pope Urban II and the Roman Catholic Church. Why does the Pope say yes to this appeal for help from an ostensible enemy, the Byzantine Emperor? And what would be in this for Urban? Why does he end up supporting this mass holy war in the East? We have to remember the context for the Pope is one of church reform and a series of wars between the Roman Catholic Church and the kings of France and Germany. For the last several decades, the popes in Rome have been trying to assert their leadership role within Western Christianity. They have been trying to show that popes are above kings, that spiritual authority is higher and more important than secular authority, and that the subjects of Western kings owe their allegiance first and foremost to God and to the Pope as his representative. Now, in the 1070s, the popes, Pope Gregory VII had engaged in the investiture war against the King of Germany. Again, this is fought over the Pope's claim that only he can appoint bishops to lead churches in Western Europe. Kings have been appointing bishops for centuries. The popes are now claiming that right for their own. The investiture war is still going in the 1090s. Pope Gregory VII has died. Urban II, the new pope, had been one of his key advisors and continues his hardline position. By the 1090s, Urban II has excommunicated the King of Germany and the King of France, both for appointing bishops without church permission, and also in the King of France's case for incest and bigamy. The Pope is trying to gain greater support among Europe's warriors. And he realizes that the chance for a holy war under church leadership is a chance to take away the king's noble base, to appeal directly to dukes and counts, to nobles and knights, and tell them that their allegiance goes to the Pope and not to their territorial ruler. Under these circumstances, the appeal from the Byzantine emperor comes at just the right moment. Pope Urban II decides to say yes. He decides that he can build an army of Western European knights, pulling them out of France and Germany, and redirecting the violent tendencies of European knights against non-Christian targets. In 1095, therefore, Urban II went on a preaching tour of French and German territories. He travels into the homelands of the kings who he has spiritually cut off from the church. He invites all of their bishops and leading nobles to meet with him, but says the kings are not welcome at these meetings, and he preaches crusade. He does so in feudal terms. We have contemporary descriptions of the Pope's sermons, which seem to have been very effective. he uses the language of medieval feudal society. We know that he told both bishops and knights that they are all great landowners. They are all the wealthy of the earth. And who do they have their land from? Land might be, in theory, a grant from a king, but the true grantor of land and wealth is God Almighty. In feudal European terms, the kings are outranked by God. And all the nobles and knights and bishop are the vassals of God and Jesus. They owe him service in exchange for land. So the Pope says, your feudal lord is Jesus, and his manor, his feudal estate, has been stolen by the infidel, by the Muslims, by the Turks. The Pope calls on the knights of Western Europe to band together to form a holy army, to march to the aid of their feudal lord and liberate his manor, Jerusalem. And in exchange, their feudal lord will grant them new lands, will grant them more wealth, greater fortunes in a Middle East that is connected to international trade routes and that is known to be brimming over with wealth. So this appeal took fire. It had tremendous appeal to the elites of European society. A crusade fervor takes over in 1095 and 1096. We hear of noblemen mortgaging their castles and basically selling off their extra possessions to be able to buy extra horses and armor for their knights to join in this crusade. They're doing it partly out of religious fervor, but partly out of a desire for wealth. The sense that maybe if they die on the way, they're going to go to heaven, but if they don't, they're going to have greater estates, greater lands than they've ever had access to before. So the Pope builds up this massive army. Tens of thousands of European warriors respond to the call. Several Crusader armies under regional nobles begin marching down to the Mediterranean and then moving east to the Byzantine Empire. So this is how the Crusade begins. It's this series of factors, all rooted in internal division in the Muslim world and in Europe. They put different Christian and Muslim military forces on a collision course. Now, why does it succeed? The First Crusade, in military terms, is a series of horrific blunders. First of all, there's the initial phase known as the Peasants' Crusade, which is completely unplanned, which catches the church and the nobility and the Byzantine Empire by surprise. Peasants are expected by the church to stay at home and work the farms, yet tens of thousands of them hear rumors of this call to liberate the Holy Land. They run away from their farms, they arm themselves, they march towards the east, and they loot and commit various crimes along the way. In particular, peasant crusaders are involved in horrific attacks on Jewish communities in various parts of Europe, scapegoating minorities that they see as non-Christian and therefore as targets. Now, when the actual military campaign gets underway, it does not have a united command. It is led by about a dozen different nobles, most of whom hate each other and see each other as rivals for the lands to be gained in the east. The Pope himself is elderly and doesn't go in person. He sends along a bishop who does his best to keep the nobles from feuding and turning on each other. But all sorts of problems occur. When they get to Constantinople, they quarrel with and insult the Byzantines. The Byzantines end up refusing to send their own soldiers as part of the expedition. They simply transport the Crusaders across to Asia, but then leave them to their own devices. The supply lines are bad. The intelligence is bad. Casualties are high. The campaign lasts from 1097 into 1099. And by that third year, almost all the horses in the army are dead. Most of the knights who have gone on the campaign are trudging on foot. The Crusaders have walked into several situations where they are outmaneuvered, where they're temporarily trapped and under siege and then break out again. So how do they win? Why does the First Crusade ultimately succeed in capturing Jerusalem from the Turks in the summer of 1099? The reason is that the Muslim forces arrayed to defend against this large Crusader army are even more divided than the Crusaders themselves. The war between the Sunni Seljuk Turks and the Shiite Fatimid Egyptians is still ongoing. And this cripples Turkish defenses as the Crusaders attack them from the northwest. Shiite Muslim Egyptians are also attacking from the southwest, trying to take advantage of the situation. So the crusade commits many mistakes and takes heavy losses, but at key moments, the Turks are distracted by their other ongoing war. In 1098, the Crusaders win a victory at Antioch in Syria, partly because the Egyptians attack Jerusalem from the south at the same time. Jerusalem actually falls out of Turkish hands and back into Shiite Egyptian hands. Then in 1099, when the Crusaders advance on Jerusalem, it's been recaptured by the Shiites. The Sunnis will do nothing to help them. And as a result, Jerusalem is undermanned when the Crusader army gets there. So finally, the Crusaders besiege Jerusalem for 2 months, June, July 1099. They storm it with siege towers and scaling ladders, and when they break into the city, they are successful in taking the streets. The result is a horrific massacre. Crusaders run amok in the city, killing men, women, and children who get in their way, probably killing Christians and Jews indiscriminately alongside Muslims. Finally, when the killing calms down, the Crusaders claim the land in and around Jerusalem for themselves. So this is the outcome of the First Crusade. In the short term, it's a Crusader victory. The nobles who had led the First Crusade then divide up the territories of the Levant into what becomes 4 Crusader states. The largest is called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And basically it becomes a French and German colonial movement in the Middle East. The Pope is also the short-term winner here. The prestige of the papacy rises in Western Europe. Within a few decades, the kings of France and Germany reconcile with the Pope and concede the right of popes to appoint bishops. On the other hand, the Crusader territories in the Middle East are going to be difficult to defend in the long term. They spark tremendous Muslim anger and recognition of a greater need for unity against these foreign invaders. And although the Crusader colonists call for reinforcements from the west and build castles to defend what they've seized, they're surrounded, and they're going to be inevitably outnumbered as Muslim states try to retake Crusader territory. Over the next century, over the 1100s, you see a series of Muslim counterattacks that grow in force and organization and sophistication. And ultimately, in the 1170s, 3/4 of a century after the First Crusade, a great Muslim leader named Saladin would begin to unify the Muslim Middle East and set up the conditions for a successful reconquest. Saladin is a Sunni Muslim general. Ethnically, he is Kurdish, part of the Kurdish peoples who live in parts of Turkey and Iran and Iraq today. Saladin had fought for the Shiite Egyptians for some time, but in 1171 he launched a coup in Cairo, Egypt. He took over Egypt's government and founded a new Sunni Muslim dynasty there. Now, once there are Sunnis in charge of Egypt, Saladin is able to build a coalition with other Sunni Turkish nobles in parts of Syria and the Levant and Iraq. And he ends up building a large Egyptian kingdom and allied Sunni forces to begin attacking the Crusader kingdoms. In 1187, he defeated the Crusader army in battle at the Battle of Hattin and recaptured Jerusalem. After Saladin retakes the city of Jerusalem, there would be subsequent crusades launched to try to take it back. But none would be able to repeat the success of the first. Instead, later crusades, often led by European kings, would falter as the European leaders quarreled among themselves. The Third Crusade is led by the King of England, Richard the Lionheart, and the King of France, Philip Augustus. It manages to defeat Saladin briefly in battle, but then the French and the English quarrel. The French go home, and the English can't besiege Jerusalem by themselves. So Saladin works out a compromise where he will allow Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem again, but the city will remain under Muslim rule. The Fourth Crusade is the most disastrous of the later crusade efforts. In 1204, an army is gathered from French and German knights by the Pope. It's sent to the east to try to recapture Jerusalem, but it runs out of money. And in order to try to regain cash funds, it makes a deal with the Italian banking city of Venice. And the leaders of Venice say that they will stake the crusade, they will give it greater financial support if it attacks Byzantine Constantinople, a trading rival with this rising Italian city. So the Catholic Christian Crusaders in 1204 stop moving against their supposed target in the Muslim world, and instead they attack the Byzantines, who had called the Crusade movement into being in the first place, and by now are deeply regretting it. The Fourth Crusade succeeds in seizing and sacking Constantinople and overthrowing the Byzantine emperors. And actually, for almost a century, then a French knight sits on the throne of what they call the Latin Kingdom in Constantinople. The Byzantines would finally recapture their capital in the 1300s. But this is essentially a fatal blow to Byzantine power. They never managed to recover what was left of their empire's strength. After they retake their capital from the Crusaders, the Byzantines are basically a shell of the former empire, limited to the lands right around Constantinople itself. And that's going to set the foundations for their ultimate takeover by a later Turkish power, the Ottoman Turks, in the 1400s. In the long run, the Crusades encourage further international trade contact between Mediterranean Europe and the Middle East. However, they leave a legacy of hate and violence between parts of the Christian and Muslim world that sadly persists to the present day.